Hello, I'm Kimberly Underwood, Director of Digital News Media for AFCEA International Signal Media. Welcome to this episode of our Disruptive by Design podcast. I'm sitting down with Meredith Caligiuri from Viasat. And to say Meredith is a talented engineer is really an understatement. She has ushered many advanced technologies into use over the last 2 decades at Viasat, including test infrastructure, secure satellite networks, and today she is working on a hybrid space architecture to increase space-related network resilience for the company's efforts related to DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit. And her breadth of knowledge is as outstanding as is her passion for STEM education. She speaks about her role in supporting an all-girls robotics team and the importance of girls and women in STEM fields. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, women made up only about 16% of engineers and architects in 2023. So this is really an important issue for Meredith. And she also mentions AFCEA's role in supporting STEM. For those of you who don't know, AFCEA has a wonderful educational foundation, our ED Foundation, that supports STEM education for everyone, men and women. For example, in late June, we announced our spring 2025 scholarship winners. We awarded $137,000 worth of scholarships to 43 students across the country, majoring in STEM degrees from cybersecurity to astronomy to physics. And our winners included ROTC, active duty, veteran students, men and women from around the country, from Houston, the Twin Cities, East Tennessee, Albany, Denver, Idaho, Colgate, Puerto Rico, Arizona State, South Florida, Mississippi State. And we also award teachers grants. So if you want more information about any of those, please check our website under the AFCEA Educational Foundation, and we'll also put a link up here. And like Meredith, we'd all encourage you to support a robotics team or a coders competition. In the DC area, you can support at the community college level through, Prince George's Community College or Nova, or through your local high school or middle school. And with that, let's hear more from Meredith Caligiuri. Hello, welcome to Disruptive by Design. I'm here today with Meredith Caligiuri. Hi, Meredith. How are you?
Hi, Kimberly. It's nice to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to believe, but I've actually been at Viasat for nearly 20 years now. Actually, I think next week is actually my official 20-year mark. And I started right out of college, and I can actually assert that time really does fly. When I really think about my journey here at Viasat, it's really been kind of, I would say, at the core, a collection of different building blocks. When I first started at Viasat, I actually started in our crypto business, and what this really taught me in those first years was how to provide secure connectivity across a network. My role, my specific role, was actually writing a lot of the test infrastructure, and kind of doing this and being able to interconnect with some of the different systems. It forced me to really understand the intricacies of how to connect satellite networks securely. I really got to transition then into working on more, broader network architectures. And, I was able to kind of focus on, how do you define and develop network architectures that can kind of combat a wide range of different threat conditions and scenarios. And one of my favorite parts of that role in particular is I really got to model and assess the different attributes of space networking. What makes things resilient? What are the different threat vectors? And really, what are the approaches that can actually mitigate those threats? And really, that kind of set me up into my next role, which was I would say it was actually a pretty fun role. I got to start our first advanced programs group. And our focus, and I would say our vision there, was to be able to work on prototyping and doing things like rapid development of what those new disruptive technologies that the company needed to look at. And that included things like getting to work on advanced waveforms, and advanced waveforms that or LPI, which means low probability of intercept and detection and geolocation. And then, other technologies that were really fun is like, developing some new free space optic, which is, essentially like laser communications. Kind of really, which then brings me up into kind of what I'm doing today, a lot more focus on, which is hybrid networking. And how to do things like multi-orbit connectivity for establishing those resilient communications. And so, this is something that we know is kind of a key priority for our government customers. And kind of that's really been my journey and kind of where I'm at today.
Right, so truly disruptive by design here. Fascinating, kind of the advanced waveform piece, and then the alternative PNT. Those are definitely cutting edge technologies. What was it about your experience or even your education that helped you kind of be able to, start that advanced programs group or go into these kind of emerging technologies?
Really, I would say again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's just having a lot of that breadth of the technologies. And I think, really understanding what are the capabilities that are needed to be able to maintain connectivity, even in kind of these threat environments. And I think, understanding what the different technology capabilities are and then really just being able to now start to actually prototype, kind of almost establishing like those tiger teams.
Sure, and I don't know what detail you can go into, but can you talk about some of the efforts you're working on currently?
Yeah. Yeah. So some of the efforts that we're working on currently, are really kind of focused on a lot of the things I was just describing, especially in the advanced networking. So I'll kind of highlight just a few of them that I think are really exciting. One of the ones I'll kind of start off with is, a work that we're doing with the Office of Undersecretary of Defense, that we're kind of collaborating with them very closely. We've developed a solution. That is designed to kind of connect the disparate networks that will enable kind of seamless information sharing and support things like command and control across different unmanned and manned autonomous systems. We call it music. It stands for multi-domain uncrewed secure integrated communications. I know it's really a mouthful, but at its core, really, it's enabling seamless and resilient connectivity for these autonomous platforms. How we do that is really using each of these different pathways, and it's at its core, it's driven by our software-defined networking capability. We call it net agility, and it's really at the core for facilitating that mesh network orchestration across all of these platforms and kind of creating that orchestration layer to make sure that all of the devices and all the systems are kind of interconnected, across that mesh network. Another one that we're really starting to support is under DIU's hybrid space architecture. We're one of many industry partners for that effort as well. But if you take a look at the core of what HSA or hybrid space architecture is, its objective is to increase network resilience, which is really the focus of my team today. And what we're doing is, what the vision is to employ kind of multi-path routing of, communication systems and networks. And it's designed to kind of optimize that data transport and really focus on mitigating adverse effects caused by different threat vectors. And for that effort, what we're bringing forward is kind of our own hybrid adaptive network. And our hybrid adaptive network is designed to kind of connect users and these different networks based on kind of the mission needs or the threat information, and to be able to do that as efficiently and resiliently as possible. And so that's kind of the core of that one. And the last one I'll kind of highlight is the NASA CSP. It's the Communication Service Project under NASA. And we're, again, like one of a few providers that are kind of supporting future networking demands for their next generation of communications. And, again, these capabilities that we're developing for NASA are really, transformative, but they're also can be used for defense applications as well. And so what we're doing and what our focus is being able to provide kind of a commercial space relay service that supports things like real-time, streaming as well as command and control, for example. Our service that we're bringing to market is, kind of taking that hybrid approach again, where we're, taking advantage of things like intersatellite relay links through our geo network. as well as, using things like our ground station as a service. And so that way it can kind of support a wider range of different mission needs. And, depending on kind of the requirements or the mission requirements, like latency, for example, you can, utilize either of the links depending on kind of what's really needed. And, all of these are kind of happening, and it kind of gives you a picture of what my teams are working on today.
Right, you make it sound so easy.
It's
Um,
definitely fun, I will say.
right. Yeah, I wanted to ask pick a little thread with the DIU project, kind of that hybrid multipath routing. What's involved with a hybrid adaptive network and kind of what does that mean that it's adaptive? That sounds very cool.
Yeah, I mean, at the core of what we're doing with the hybrid adaptive networking is what we're doing is actually just leveraging data. At the core, it's being able to understand, what type of capabilities or networking solutions are needed for an individual, mission or an individual, user, and being able to use things like data to drive those orchestration engines. And, really what we're trying to do is make sure that as you start to bring in multiple layers, our own network, but also a lot of third party and government networks as well. And so as you start to kind of bring those networks together as kind of an integrated space layer, it allows users to be able to roam across different networks and really be able to maneuver kind of very intelligently, based on what are the mission needs, what type of network is required. Does it require low latency? Does it require a lot of throughput? And so, or does it, require to be able to operate in the presence of different threats, like interference, for example? And so, as you start to kind of, build out that hybrid adaptive network or those networking layers, it allows users to be able to maintain connectivity, which is really, again, at the core of what we're trying to do.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about music. That's such a great acronym. I love hearing about kind of how you're bringing in this kind of unmanned, uncrewed piece. And I know even today with the Defense Department, when they were announcing their budget to the press today, they talked about kind of the billions of dollars going into autonomy and AI. Can you talk about kind of what are the challenges there, kind of the groundbreaking things that you're doing, whether it's in regard to C2 or the other aspects of music?
Yeah, I mean, again, for music, really at the core of music is, being able to take these different platforms, and interconnect them. And, there's a couple different transport pathways off these platforms, and, some of them kind of use line of sight connectivity, and some of them have, beyond line of sight, which means like using SATCOM, for example. And it's trying to orchestrate them together. And if one pathway is degraded or denied, it's using that entire mesh network. So if you think of lots of nodes that are interconnected, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to connect at the edge to cloud. And so what music does is, again, it features our net agility software-defined networking, and it's able to kind of use the different networking paths to kind of orchestrate these platforms. And it supports things like making, C2 command and control, as well as, making sure that situational awareness is kind of propagating across the entire network. And so, if you kind of think of, the hybrid adaptive network in music, it's really starting to establish hybrid connectivity in like kind of the terrestrial layer, but also in the SATCOM layer. And that's kind of the core of both of those programs.
Right, that's fascinating. And then I know you all are doing work with the Space Force with their EST, their Enterprise Space Terminal. Can you talk about kind of that phase 2 and why do you think you guys were selected and kind of what's the effort involved in general?
Yeah, so phase one, was, kind of led out of our space and mission systems team. And that effort through phase one. So we were on the phase one team, and it, that took, part of phase one was kind of going through PDR. And, I would think why we were selected is I think, we were really being, able to kind of bring, a lot of our innovation and a lot of our, knowledge in, interconnectivity and free space optics, to really kind of push the envelope, so to speak. And now, with phase two underway, we get to kind of work with the government to kind of further that design. And I think, we're really excited to be part of the EST, phase two program. I mean, I think we're really excited about what they're trying to do with trying to bring things like standards-based interoperability. And, what this really means is being able to, have systems that can kind of speak the language across networks. And, at the heart of EST is really development of kind of a common waveform standard. Again, like so it can kind of communicate across these different networks. And so that any system that's kind of carrying the EST compatible terminal, can provide interoperability across this like space mesh network. Sorry, it's a mouthful. And it allows things like, establishing, flexible routing in space, so that if there is links that are being disruptive or unavailable, that you can kind of now flexibly route in space, similar to kind of what we're doing with, the music in the terrestrial environment, starting to bring some of those capabilities also, in the space layer as well.
Wanted to kind of ask, given your expertise in being in the industry, from your perspective, back in the day, obviously the military, they had more kind of a role in their, MilSat. ComSatcom has evolved over even though just the last few years,
Yeah.
it seems to be changing, evolving quickly. And kind of what you described on what you're working on shows that. But can you kind of give us a perspective from your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like the commercial SATCOM industry has really progressively innovated and transformed the space market over the last few years. And I think they're going to continue to do so in the future. And, as you kind of ask that question, I'll kind of think about like maybe three different areas. The first area that I think the commercial SATCOM industry has really evolved is from a technology perspective. The other area is really from a network management or an orchestration perspective. And the third I'll kind of bring up is from a business model perspective. And so, when you think about from the technology spot side, why, commercial SATCOM has had to innovate is really to be able to, keep up with the increasing demand for supply. As commercial has shifted away from, some of the legacy approaches of using things like large spot beam that covers like large geographic areas that all of the users have to operate under, to more interactive networking designs, for example, that use kind of smaller and more flexible spot beams. This is really designed to be able to serve a higher number of users and also really be able to be more flexible in order to adjust where capacity is being delivered so that you can, meet where, the demand is most needed at any given time. What this also does, it also reduces the impact of jamming, for example. And this is something that I know like we've worked on with our new next generation of satellite networks, and I know others are doing the same as well. Another example on the technology front is kind of using more distributed ground architectures, and this also similarly offers advantages for our commercial customers where it reduces the impact of outages. And from a government side, that will also kind of reduces their ability to collect on an individual user. And so that's kind of on the technology front, kind of moving towards like the network management and maneuvering capabilities. Commercial has had to evolve to be able to make sure that we can meet things like the quality of service or avoid outages or avoid congestion, for example. And I think, we do network maneuvering kind of on the orders of like tens of thousands of times per day. And I know this is also being provided is also occurring for other industry partners, where they're doing it at like tens to even millions of times per day. And this is really how the cell phone industry operates as well. And again, it's designed to kind of reduce the potential of outages, and it supports things like better switching and better roaming across available networks. And the other part there is that commercial is really working towards providing better access to like our network through more open APIs or interfaces that promote better information sharing between the government and or our customers, and being able to share that information. And that last factor I'll just highlight real quickly is really just being able to move towards service-based models where, customers pay for what they consume. And this gives more flexibility. It avoids things like vendor lock, and, it really does inspire, and foster continued innovation.
Right, sure. And kind of as DoD and the Space Force pursue this vision of, a hybrid integrated space network, kind of seamlessly between government and commercial to better support their missions against, adversaries in, more difficult environments. Kind of, can you talk about what's the security need for all of this as you're doing these, groundbreaking, orchestration and hybrid networking? Kind of what's that security side of things, and how are you guys going about to effectively secure these advances?
That's a really important question to ask, actually, because I think as you increase the number of space assets, what you're really doing is you're expanding that attack surface of that overarching, network. And if you kind of think about what do customers want, they really desire things like security and they desire things like integrity and they, really, really desire things like availability of the services that you're using. And so I think if you think about like the historic approach, what you would see is kind of like you would see things like answering security related requirements or, like how are you securing your network? And I think, the other thing that you'd see is more things like boundary security. And that's kind of the old way of thinking about cybersecurity. How do you keep the bad guys out? But this presents kind of a few different challenges. One, it just provides kind of a point in time assessment. So as the network changes or, anything changes in the network, you have stale information. And the other challenge it has is, as users have multiple choices, especially with like a hybrid, for example, it may not be evident to a user what system is the most secure and, to be able to fit kind of what their mission need is. And so I think it requires a little bit of like reorienting how we, look at these systems and use these systems. And, requires kind of using things like frameworks that allow for more regular reporting of status. And, with that, it allows users to adapt their mission based on what the latest security posture is and gives them that better insight. And I think finally, it really does require evolving how we protect our networks in general. I think service providers, have more and more users and more devices on their networks every single day, especially as we start to expand the capacity that's available. And so as these networks become more integrated, there needs to be better tools and, better applications that can be able to do things like understanding behavioral analytics. And that allows, these tools to be able to detect when there's things like anomalous actors are on a network, for example. And I think, putting that, the right level of automation in place, allows providers to deploy mitigations in real time and really take advantage of these analytics.
How, with the military, relying on artificial intelligence, machine learning more and more, what does that mean for this vision of hybrid networking and seamless battlefield communications? Kind of what are the impacts and what are the considerations, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the areas that I think is really starting to grow and kind of proliferate. I'll maybe highlight kind of two primary areas that I personally think about. And I think it's really useful for, improving kind of the network communications for the battlefield, especially as things like AI ML become more widely adopted. The first one I'll highlight is it really is useful in delivering better and more intelligent network automation. We've been talking about that a lot today, right? How do you improve the network decisions? I think, things like AI ML are going to be able to take advantage of things like AI-driven systems that can kind of automate the provisioning and reconfiguration of network resources. And they can do that much faster than a human on the loop. And so it can take account for kind of the current communication options, and it can also take account for like kind of the current conditions, and what type of data needs to be transmitted, and what are the best network that should be utilized for that traffic. And I think these algorithms are capable of analyzing a vast amount of network telemetry, and so it can detect things like anomalies, it can predict failures, and it can really optimize the traffic routing, which is really crucial for maintaining communications across some of these evolving threat scenarios that we're seeing. The second one I kind of touched on already, which is supporting things like threat analysis. I think includes both the cyber domain as well as the interference domain. As we start to bring things like AI into how to protect our networks, we can be able to do things like manage our spectrum more dynamically. And so that if you detect interference, you can maneuver in the spectrum domain to be able to overcome or mitigate the effects of that interference. And then on the cyber domain as well, you can kind of continuously monitor those data flows, and it can really bolster the cybersecurity, for the network and for the users. And so, ultimately what that does is it reduces proliferation of a potential cyber attack. So, I think the core of AI and these ML tools is really bringing the ability to process and act upon on data at speeds and scales that's not humanly possible, right? And that's really the value, and I think it's really gonna really transform like how we do connect, improve the connectivity for our warfighters in the future.
Right, sure. And I'm excited to ask you also about this next topic, something I'm just learning about as a reporter called D2D or direct to device.
Yeah.
We're just, in fact, working on our first article on it. And it's, it seems so exciting, to have the possibility of, your cell phone, be connected directly to a satellite, but also any device. Can you talk about what is D2D, the potential, for the military and defense, and kind of what you all are working on as far as that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, like DTD is is direct to device. It's a broad term that I think encompasses a lot of different use cases. I think primarily it's used for things like direct to handset or mobile device connectivity. It's also connecting in the automotive domain, and it's also really going to be necessary for as things like the mass IoT become more proliferated, right? And I think this, is supports both kind of government and defense applications. As you kind of highlighted already, it enables things like satellites to communicate directly with standard devices, like your everyday cell phone or your watches or any other, device that is kind of coming to the market, right? And it doesn't require things like exquisite terminals or exquisite ground infrastructure. And I think as we think about the value to the DoD market, it's really providing, additional access to spectrum. It also reduces the size and swap, or the size of all of these devices that are carried by soldiers or integrated into weapon systems. And so it gives the DoD access to the latest commercial technology. But it also really reduces the barrier of connectivity in regions where things like the terrestrial services are spotty or prone to disruption. I'd say like the example that most people kind of tend to resonate is like you're driving on a highway and you might hit a dead spot and your cell phone call drops. But I think when you think about it from a warfighter perspective, if that happens, from a soldier in a Humvee, they might not get access to their data. So I think things like D2D kind of provides that more readily available, connectivity to their devices. And so it really gives them that more flexible access. And personally, I think it's really exciting to see, how, all of the engagement, I know, government and industry are actively engaged in pursuing DTD, for example. And Viasat recently entered into an agreement with the European Space Agency to explore public-private partnerships for, direct to device services for both, consumers and warfighters. And I think, opportunities like this are going to continue, and I think we're really excited to be part of the conversation.
And your breadth of knowledge, Meredith, that you have, as you spearhead these advancements is so impressive, from just a basic understanding of, space operations to orbits to spacecraft to let alone the intricacies of, networks and comms and relays and ground stations. Can you talk about kind of the need for scientific knowledge that you rely on to do your job and STEM and for women and girls to enter this field as space will become only more and more important going forward. Can you talk about kind of what STEM education means to you and in particular why it's important to encourage young women and girls in technology?
Yeah, I mean this is a really great question and it really hits home in particular. It really has been really important to me personally, to have support systems throughout my career. And STEM education in particular is something I'm really passionate about. Right now I currently coach a robotics team of like sixth grade girls. And they've got a lot of energy, I will say that, but it's really important for me to be able to let them recognize that they can see that there's opportunities in STEM for them. A lot of them just didn't even know that, what engineers did or, what goes into making something as common like a cell phone. It requires kind of a wide breadth of STEM resources. Last year they made it to the states championship, and so they really loved that. But I think for me, it's really more about, it's not about the technology teaching them, right? It's more about how to, inspire them to be solvers, really and spark their own enthusiasm, to STEM in general. I want them to think of themselves as innovators, and have the confidence to solve problems and do it creatively, regardless of what they pursue. And I think it takes a village in general to provide, these different types of opportunities. And so it's really great to see the commitment and passion, for STEM girls.
Absolutely. And anything else you wanted to highlight or share about your career or your journey or, the future?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'll just close, I think, with, Kimberly, thank you again for this opportunity to be on this podcast, and be able to talk to you about some of these topics and these industry trends that we're seeing kind of play out. It's something I'm really passionate about. And I think from a government military market, it's really an exciting time. So I think I kind of just close with is, just reemphasizing that, there is really a challenge as we kind of prepare for it and have to move at a pace and a speed that can kind of defeat our adversaries. And we really are striving to make sure that there is never a day without space. And what that really means at its core is meaning there's never a mission that's disconnected. And I think that's what my teams are developing capabilities for. And I think it, really is necessary to kind of meet the challenge that is kind of required. And, really requires that ongoing collaboration and the ability to be able to access that latest innovation within the commercial space industry. And I think really this is at the forefront of things like the Space Force commercial space integration strategy, which I think is really trying to bring forward things like bringing industry and bringing commercial solutions into these space layers. And I really think it's going to be exciting to kind of see these capabilities evolve. I think it's as we've partnered with DIU through the hybrid space architecture and EST, for example, we're really excited to be part of these opportunities, and we really think it, is kind of crucial, for the future success of military operations.
Well, thank you, Meredith. Thank you for sharing your expertise and giving us a vision of what's happening in the industry today and why it's needed, and for being so inspiring to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly.